Ukraine is clearly a vast landmass, surrounded almost in a kind of like a D shape by Belarus to the north, and then Russia all the way around. And of course, Russia, for all the problems it's been having, the absolutely dominant naval player here in the Black Sea. So it is completely ringed almost, except for this western border, which luckily for Ukraine is obviously a border with NATO countries. And although there have been air attacks and so on in cities in the west and so on, so far the Russians have not done very much to try to interrupt Western arms flows. They've not been able to do very much to alter the free movement of personnel back and forth across this border. Obviously, many thousands of Ukrainians coming abroad as refugees, several thousands coming for military training in the West, here in Britain, very successfully, and a new program soon to get underway in the European Union, I think in Germany and in Poland. And these sympathetic allies have been crucial as a sanctuary, as I say, for refugees, as a place which gives Ukraine additional strategic depth. Even some of the higher grade repair work on Ukrainian equipment is probably being done in some of the NATO countries close to its border. And of course, crucially, in an absolute sort of military textbook sense, because of the strategic geography, Ukraine has internal lines of communication, and Russia has very, very long external lines of communication. Now, obviously, the good thing for Russia is that it's got a very well-developed rail system, and it's particularly attuned its rail systems to its military and strategic needs. And we've seen an awful lot of rail used in this conflict. Just to get a sense of the scale of all of this, I mean, this is the front line if it was stretched out in a single line. We are talking about vast distances, and even the very large military formations that are deployed in this war, they're tiny parcels of forces compared to the kind of units that were fighting over this same terrain during the Second World War between the Nazis and Russia. Remember too that the war hasn't just started now. For Ukraine, it's been going on for some considerable time. Huge disparities, as you see there in that comment, in terms of population and so on. But that period of the war, since in the East, since 2014, has been very important for Ukraine. It's not only honed many of the military formations that were able to play a very significant role in the early defense of the country in the wake of Russia's invasion, but it also prompted an awful lot of training relationships with the West. Ukraine's special forces were largely trained by their Western equivalents and so on. And that set up a pattern and a set of relationships that I think were very important going forward into the conflict itself. Now, I talk about a transparent battlefield. I mean, clearly one shouldn't overstate this. We're not watching this on closed circuit television, blow by blow. But nonetheless, the advent of the mobile phone, an extraordinary means of gathering video, still pictures, sound, of transmitting it and so on, is crucial. And then you have the whole panoply of the social media, YouTube, Messenger, Telegram, Twitter, Facebook, the whole lot. And that has enabled us to be able to watch key events unfolding, and certainly also to get a picture of what the conflict looks like to some extent. Now, clearly, it's a particularly carefully chosen picture. We see the things that people want to put out, but nonetheless, it gives you a sense of what the terrain looks like. It gives you a sense of what the combat looks like, and so on. And of course, crucially, all of these things have provided vital intelligence, both intelligence in a military sense. You have Ukrainians using mobile phones and plugging into a network to basically provide targeting information for their own forces from occupied areas and so on. But you also have clearly the ability of people outside to get a real sense of what is going on. And that, of course, was crucial in the run-up to the war. Remember, we arrived at this stage with, let's be honest, a Western intelligence system which was not hugely successful in the past. The Iraq War had cast a great shadow. People were skeptical about what was going on. And because of all this freely available so-called open source information, you didn't have to wait until the Americans, for example, declassified a particular satellite image. You could see things as they were actually happening. This is a CIT. It's actually surprisingly a Russian open source organization. They and individuals and so on were posting pictures of the buildup of the Russian forces around Ukraine's borders. That's a little after the opening of the war. But again, you can buy satellite photos. They're not that expensive. Organizations can do this. Media groups can do this and so on. And this is the kind of granularity you get from a civilian satellite. It's quite extraordinary. You can see the aircraft types, you can count them, and so on and so forth. And because of all this information flooding around so openly, before the war, the Ministry of Defence, who has been putting out a daily sort of intelligence update, which is a kind of, there are political lines in it, but it is nonetheless a very useful intelligence assessment. They were able to put out this picture before the war of what they believed the Russians would do. And surprise, surprise, the Belarus president, the equivalent of the people filming the files as ministers walk into Downing Street and reading off what they were going to do. Well, this was the Belarus president speaking before the war, presumably with a map that he'd got from the Russians, explaining to people what they were going to do. So there was no great surprise. Amateur enthusiasts have been able to, this is a guy who puts out regular little maps like this. He's a huge partisan of the Ukrainians. I wouldn't necessarily always accept everything he says, but the maps themselves are very useful, updated regularly. This is what this information environment allows. There are some strange and interesting sources of information. This comes from NASA's FIRMS detection system. I can't remember what FIRM stands for, but this is essentially a NASA kind of environmental satellite system that monitors fires, outbreaks of fire in the world. I mean, you can imagine in the terrible wildfires we've seen in Australia and elsewhere. It's an extremely useful tool. Well, surprise, surprise, of course, battlefields involve an awful amount of fire as well. And that has been a useful tool to be able to monitor what's going on. The ability to monitor, certainly at least in free airspace, international flights has been hugely useful. And this is just on a particular day or particular few days, the tracks of Swedish and NATO intelligence gathering aircraft around Belarus and Ukraine, hoovering up signals intelligence, data of all kinds, voice transmissions, and what have you. And just if you want to follow a particular aircraft and you're an enthusiast for these things, well, there you are. Somebody was following this particular Royal Air Force RC-135 Rivet Joint, which is a signals intelligence gathering aircraft about the size of a Boeing 707 or something, as it was tootling around off the coast of Crimea. In the news today, you heard the sentences given to, in absentia, sadly, given to the people who are believed to have been behind the shooting down of the MH17 airliner. Bellingcat, the organization that did an extraordinary job in identifying forensically who those individuals were, did another very interesting piece of work a week, 10 days or so ago, which looked at who were the targeteers, who were the people who were setting out the targets, all these electricity power stations and what have you in Ukraine that were being hit by the Russians. And it's this group of people here. I mean, they look nice enough, but I suppose you could say they're doing their job. But, Bellingcat probably have phone records from them. They probably have their names and addresses and so on and so forth. And this is all stuff that is open source available if you know where to go and get it, or you're prepared to pay for it. As I think Bellingcat do pay for some stuff that they get from places like Russia. So it's an extraordinary world of information. Now, of course, the problem is that that's all very well, but you've got to make your assessment. And one of the great difficulties is, whilst we were able to monitor the Russian build-up very carefully. We knew very little about what Ukraine was going to do. Ukraine was very reticent. Ukraine, remember, was being warned all the time. Good Lord, an invasion is imminent. And they would say, well, don't worry, we don't need to go onto a war footing yet, and so on. And there are many reasons for that. And in part also, I think there was a reticence in dealing with the Americans, because the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley, was known, I think, to be rather skeptical as to how Ukraine would fare in this conflict. And I'm afraid that was a view that really extended across Western intelligence organizations. This quote here from the former Prime Minister shows you that this was very much the view that even though people had given token help to Ukraine and so on and so forth, if push came to shove, the Russians would simply roll through. And of course, the Russians didn't simply roll through. On the eve of the war, remarkable degree of visibility of what the Russians were doing, an erroneous picture of the Russian capabilities. I'll come to that in a moment. Very little understanding of what Ukraine might be able to do. Now, we greatly overestimated the Russians. The idea was, in the circles that follow these things, that whilst Western countries were engaged in faraway counterinsurgency operations, whilst their military forces were losing many of the skills of high-intensity warfare, the Russians were modernizing, were improving, were incorporating electronic warfare and a whole range of other key systems for high-intensity combat into their forces down to ever lower levels. There were new equipment was being bought. And one of the sort of poster children of this new Russian military rearmament was this fellow here, the Armata tank, the T-14, which was first revealed in May 2015 at one of the Moscow Victory Day parades. I think we've seen 7 or 8 of these, 2017, 2018. They may have, dozen, 20 prototypes. But for a whole variety of reasons, they were never able to put this into production. It was to have been in service by 2020. Well, it very much isn't. What's interesting, it's got a crew of 3, like most Russian tanks, but it's got nobody in the turret. The crew are all down inside the vehicle. But this was a kind of a symbol of the modernization of Russian forces that was underway. And on the eve of the war, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, was talking about a far more capable Russian military. Previous attempts at reform had not worked, but now things were moving to some extent. And if you look through Russia's performance in Georgia, not great, certainly into eastern Ukraine, where it did quite well in its sort of semi-open warfare there against the Ukrainians, and particularly Syria. And Syria, I think, particularly because it contrasts very much with the terrible mess that Western countries got themselves into in the Middle East. Yes, the Russians did quite well in Syria. If you're prepared to be as brutal as they were and so on, they achieved their goals with relatively limited casualties amongst their own forces. And relatively small forces involved as well. This is a train that the Russians sent around the country, basically a mobile display of bits of equipment captured in Syria, talking about the prowess of the Russian military. The problem is this is the reality in Ukraine. This is crossing the it's crossing the Sversky Donets River in the east near Biroivka. Back in early May, there was a very brutal contested river crossing, and the Russians came off very badly indeed. Now, the Russians have performed appallingly in many ways, from their initial plans to their execution, to their logistics, to their command, to the war crimes, their inability to secure control of the air. The overall execution of their operations has been lamentable. And so, again, I think we have to be cautious, because if we're going to draw lessons from all of this, well, before the war, we kind of thought the Russians were much more capable than they were. I don't think we should necessarily run away from this conflict believing that the Russians are just totally hopeless and are a complete mess. I think when we get a much more granular in time, a much more detailed understanding of what the Russians set about, how they set about it, and why, we will be able to see that to some extent, Russia's performance has been very mixed, but it's been hobbled by the nature of the operation that they embarked upon, and really by the futility of what they were trying to do. Rather nicely, Radek Sikorski, the Polish politician and commentator, came up with this rather nice turn of phrase, which I thought was quite true. Putin's army turns out to have been a 20th century army with 19th century logistics. And of course, logistics is one of the words that the media has discovered in the wake of this war. I'm sure to an audience like this one, that is clearly of no surprise. But logistics are key. This is part of that long Russian convoy that was stranded on the road from the border towards Kyiv at the early part of the war. And of course, much of the Russian failure early on really stems from its inability to get its logistics convoys to where they were needed, particularly for an armor heavy force, which needs lots of logistics and lots of things of various kinds. Now let's look at a few of the weapon systems involved. The tank, I mean, this is a kind of typical photo that we've seen, a Russian tank incinerated with its turret blown off. And of course, one of the great great weapons of the early stage of this war were the shoulder-fired anti-tank weapons, the Javelin, the American Javelin, and this is the British Scandinavian NLAWs. Fascinating weapons, carry a very big punch. They have the capacity to both engage the target directly or fly slightly over it and hit it from above where the armor is weaker. Hence the fact that so many Russian tanks that we've seen have had these improvised cages over the top to try and protect against these downward attacks. This, interestingly as well, is a T-62, a tank really at fault in the 1973 war in the Middle East. These are the sorts of things the Russians are having to pull out from storage because they have lost so many tanks, possibly 1,400 or so far. We're obviously not sure. And the reason for the weakness of the Russian tanks and for all these blown off turrets, it's because Russian tank design went in a completely different direction to that of the West after the Second World War. The Russians went for lighter, faster, smaller, lower profile tanks. And to do that, they removed one member of the crew, the loader for the main gun, and instead they placed a kind of rotary carousel, an automatic loading system that inconveniently sits just below the crew at the bottom underneath the turret. And so you can imagine if the turret is penetrated, particularly from the top, the results are catastrophic. As you can see there in that rather nice little diagram, Western tanks keep the ammunition in relatively secure lockers away from the crew as far as is possible. That's the traditional view of the tank, ideal combination of firepower, mobility, and survivability, which dominates the close land battle. And what you've had is an awful lot of people, even in some military circles, saying, well, this is no longer the case. This is a very interesting guy I know, who's a former US Marine colonel, who's now at the National Defence University in the States. And as he's saying, as it were, the opportunity costs of ever heavier tanks to protect their crews as they lumber around. Is it really worth having this with its long logistical tail and so on? And we should remember that the US Marine Corps, which is a kind of mini armed forces in itself, at the moment under a new plan for US Marine Corps 2030, it's called, has just got rid of all of its tanks. It's focusing now on fighting a distributed operation in the Pacific against China. It's decided that a lot of these heavy systems are just simply not worth having. Now, it may well be that in Europe, in a continental land battle, the tank still has a utility. This is the guy who's in charge at the Pentagon of planning for America's next battle tank. And I think he makes a very fair point. Tanks are, so of course, they're vulnerable, but everything else is very vulnerable. And most vulnerable are individual soldiers without any armor protection. And this is, part and parcel of the age-old battle in military history between offense and defense. And indeed, the impact of the anti-tank missiles on the Russian forces in the early days of the war, it's not new. If you think back to the 1973 war, when the Egyptians crossed the Suez Canal and the Israelis happily charged with their tanks across the Sinai Desert to push the Egyptians into the canal, and they were met by, for that generation, wire-guided Soviet anti-tank missiles, Saga anti-tank missiles mainly, and they lost huge numbers of tanks. Then, as now, there were those who said, my goodness me, the tank is dead. Well, you found ways around this. And of course, one of the most important ways around this is to fight a combined arms battle. For the layperson, you have the whole orchestra, and the instruments in the orchestra may change. New technology may give you new weapon systems, but fundamentally, it's not individual weapon systems that win wars. It's how you put the whole thing together. And the crucial thing for tanks is to have infantry protection. And the Russian military, sadly for them, in the way they deployed their forces, did not have sufficient infantry. Many of the infantry units are undermanned in the Russian military at the moment. There are certainly many of them not highly trained, and they've had real problems in giving our heavy armor that essential infantry support dimension that goes some way to negating the kind of anti-tank missile that we've seen before. That's just, what some people are thinking the future main battle tank will need. It'll be a hybrid, it'll have electric power, all sorts of new sensors, onboard drones for surveillance, and of course, anti-drone defense. And we'll come to drones again in a minute. Another lesson to be drawn from the war, and certainly its early stages, is that what's very risky has now become much riskier. This is a Russian BMP 3 or 4, not entirely sure, but essentially it's a paratroop armored vehicle. Russia is one of the few countries in the world whose paratroop forces have their own dedicated armored vehicles, specially designed for the task. India, I think, deploys the same thing because they bought them from the Russians. But basically, Hostomel Airport, northwest of Kyiv, the Russians decided that their airborne forces would land there by helicopter, seize the airfield, troops would be flown in, and that would be an air bridge that would then enable them to get much closer to the Ukrainian capital. As things turned out, it was a complete mess. Initially, they seized the airport. There's a famous Matthew Chancellor, colleague of mine at the BBC, who works for CNN. He fetched up at the airport and found all these Russian paratroopers there and filmed it all. It was quite a coup for him. They were then kicked out of the airfield by the Ukrainians. The Russians eventually came back and seized it, but the whole place was a complete mess. And meanwhile, Russian airborne forces, who spearheaded a lot of the attacks into Ukraine, certainly against the capital, were chewed up pretty seriously. This is a few of them at Hostomel. Helicopters have been very vulnerable. The British military, there's a K-25 attack helicopter, sort of equivalent of a Cobra or something like that. The British Ministry of Defence reckons the Russians have lost about a quarter of their whole inventory of these so far in the war. They've proved very, very vulnerable. They've had to be used because fixed-wing air power has not been able to carry out the sorts of missions the Russians would have wanted, because they didn't destroy all of Ukraine's air defences. There have been ammunition shortages on the artillery side, so these rotary-wing aircraft have been called in to do missions which are very, very risky, and they've lost an awful lot of them in the process. So I think there's real questions now about whether the survivability of these things in a future battlefield. And that's in part because another airborne system, the unmanned aerial vehicle, has become so ubiquitous that countries are now waking up to the fact that they need to radically improve their ground-based air defences. This is another one of the early stars of the war, the Bayraktar, a Turkish drone. Simple, but relatively sophisticated. Again, this was hailed early on. It got its own Ukrainian song because it was doing such marvelous work in the early days of the war. Again, it wasn't new. If you go back to the war in Nagorno-Karabakh in 2021, Armenia lost huge numbers of tanks, which were destroyed by these Turkish-supplied drones supplied to Azerbaijan. Paradoxically, of course, they destroyed huge quantities of Armenian tanks. The Armenians weren't able to use the tanks on the ground and suffered very badly at the hands of the Azeri ground forces, which again kind of doesn't tell you that the tank is obsolete. It means that you need to keep your tanks protected and to have a combined system that allows the tanks in some way or another to survive. The Bayraktar did well early on. Possibly one reason it did well early on is that the Russians were very reluctant to use their air defenses. They were very afraid of shooting down their own systems in the first few days of the war. And so perhaps these things had a certain lease of life. By about 3 days in, certainly by about 10 days in, they were hardly being used at all and have been used much more for maritime intelligence gathering and reconnaissance. Another key loitering munition. This is the Shahed 136 Iranian supplied thing. This is something which has been launched not in swarms. Swarms imply an intelligent relationship between the different weapons involved. They've been launched in groups against Ukrainian power targets and so on. You might say Mr. Zelensky there is a loitering munition, and a rather more powerful one, because he's not gone away, and he has really, he has won the information battle on behalf of the Ukrainians. But this Iranian drone, very simple, fundamentally, based upon cheap commercial microelectronics, the sort of GPS receiver you might have in your phone or other consumer devices. And that's one of the interesting things when you start taking apart even Russian equivalents of this kind of thing. You find an awful lot of Western parts and Western electronics inside them. Of course, the other sort of drone that's been massively used in this war is this, Jessop's. You can go out and buy one yourself if you've got a spare 1,500 quid. And people have been donating these to the Ukrainians. Russians have been buying them for their own forces. And the Ukrainians were able to basically integrate these into their forces much earlier than the Russians. They've been used for reconnaissance and observation. They've been used to drop bombs and grenades and so on. Very, very simple, and in relative terms, very, very cheap. So countering drones is a key lesson of this war. We have to do a lot more to counter drones. Drones, again, used, as I mentioned earlier, in the operation to sink the Moskva. Drones were used to distract the defenses of the Moskva, to perhaps overwhelm the bridge and command crew with all sorts of different challenges to face, and the ship was taken out with Neptune anti-shipping missiles. You, of course, then have the unmanned equivalent at sea. Not so much a loitering munition, but certainly, I suppose, a kamikaze boat, if you insist on calling it that. One of these washed up back in September, and of course they were used for the attack on Sevastopol, which was again a joint unmanned boat operation involving unmanned drones as well. That may be a first. To have the two kinds of unmanned system in the same operation. And again, these are built by Ukraine, based upon commercial technology. The water jet engines from this come out of one of these. So much more, another lesson clear then from this, much more needs to be done on air defense. And what this is an M-SHORAD. It's basically brand new American system, the first of which was deployed to Europe this year. And basically it has a cannon, it has I think Stinger missiles on this one, but what it will eventually have as things are improved, we don't yet know. But it's an example of the much more sophisticated kind of anti-air defences that are going to have to be deployed with armed forces in the future. But now, of course, another great lesson, which is not new, is that for all these wonder weapons of drones and javelins and so on, artillery fundamentally is what wins wars. And actually, the Russian attack on Kyiv at the start of the war was not defeated by the javelins and the NLAWs. They had an important role. It was defeated by artillery, massed artillery from the Ukrainian side. And what's become more and more important is the capacity to be able to strike with precision. This is an M777 gun supplied by the Americans. This has been described by somebody as the capacity to deliver a precision-guided airstrike from the back of a truck. Well, that's actually the multiple launch rocket system. But this is something that can fire with the right shell to a 4-meter circular error probability. So if you're launching it at a truck, you're going to hit within 4 meters of the truck, which is there's not going to be much truck left. One crew already in Ukraine has fired about 6,000 shells from one of these. They've changed the barrels 4 times. So it just gives you a sense of the extraordinary. I mean, this is one of the greatest achievements of the Ukrainians, is actually managing the logistics of keeping, penny packets of a huge variety of different types of weapons in service. And that's quite fascinating. If you fire this out of it, the Excalibur round, which is GPS guided and so on, it can go out to about 40 kilometers, again, with a very, very high likelihood of hitting the target. One slight problem, each of these shells, I thought it was $112,000, but I looked up somewhere else and they suggested each one cost about $176,000. And the Americans have given quite a number of these to the Ukrainians, quite apart from many more ordinary high explosive shells. This is the other great precision guided piece of rocket artillery, the HIMARS, very similar to the multiple launch rocket system, which the British Army deploys, which is essentially the same thing on a tracked vehicle. It can fire a whole variety of things. It's pretty much being used with the GMLRS at the moment on the left. And of course, there is a great debate. Those who say it should be given this ATACMS, the Army Tactical Missile System, which goes out to about 300 kilometers. And there are arguments about whether that should or should not be supplied to Ukraine. One of the systems that's crucially important to Ukraine is not a weapon at all. It's this, the awful Mr. Musk. It's Starlink. Starlink is essentially a satellite broadband system. If you live in a part of the world which doesn't have great broadband, you can sign up to Starlink and watch as many TV programs as you like. And essentially, it has thousands of satellites in low Earth orbit. It's got at the moment about 3,000 odd satellites, with probably thousands more to be launched. Because it's in low Earth orbit, the latency, the speed is much better. And the deployment of this with the Ukrainians has been crucial. Essentially, it is a little dish like that, goes up to the satellite, comes down to a ground station. Where are the ground stations? Well, they're in places like Poland and I think Romania and Turkey and so on. And that has basically given the Ukrainians an extraordinary boost in terms of communications, both on the battlefield and more generally. Now, the other thing I mentioned to you, and we touched on it through looking at all these weapons, is industrial warfare. And, industrial scale warfare is back with a vengeance. And what we're seeing is extraordinary rates of attrition of equipment, extraordinary casualties. I think Mark Milley the other day suggested that both sides had about 100,000 casualties, killed and wounded. It's quite disturbing numbers. And it raises huge questions as to whether Western industry can support large-scale warfare in the future. Ukraine is using up, let me just get the right statistic. The annual production of US shells would last about 10 days to 2 weeks in the fighting in Ukraine. Now, luckily, a lot of the systems that Ukraine is using from the West are NATO standard systems, and you can get ammunition from a number of countries. But you've got extraordinary things going on early in the war when the Ukrainians were running out of Soviet caliber ammunition for their own artillery. And there was, for example, during August, daily RAF C-17 flights from Pakistan to Romania, carrying, we believe, Soviet caliber shells from Pakistan to Romania to then be passed on to the Ukrainians. And I mean, these figures on the left are not entirely accurate. It's from the Kiev Independent, which is a very nice, very good English language newspaper in Kiev. And some of the figures are not entirely right. And one of the reasons I'm keeping away from figures is, A, they're constantly changing and they're inherently unreliable. But I mean, you can see the differences there, and the proportion of the British army that would be chewed up in this kind of warfare. If you think that the Russians have lost about 1,400 tanks so far, what is it? The Challenger 3, the upgraded British Challenger 3, which will be in service initially, if we're lucky, in 2027. I think they're actually upgrading 148 of them. I mean, you might argue it's hardly worth bothering. But it raises all sorts of questions. And I think General Mike Ryan, who's a noted Australian commentator, former general, now retired, he makes the point very, very well that, we are back to war as a battle of industrial systems. Well, get your books out on the Second World War. And if you are going to arm yourself with the prospect of being able to fight a war, which is, of course, crucial to deterrence, people have got to know that you are capable of prosecuting that war, then clearly we have got to shake up what we do industrially. And given the news today and the state our economy is in, heck, it's not an easy thing to do. The days of going and developing your own system because the British Army's 150 vehicles have to be so special. No other army in the world needs a system like ours. Well, that's got to change. And the CDS, Chief of the Defence Staff, Tony Radakin, made this quite sensible point in his Lord Mayor's lecture back in October. And what does this mean? Well, it means maybe we should be a bit more like Poland. Poland needs multiple launch rocket systems, so it's buying 288 of these from South Korea. Fires NATO standard ammunition, no problem. It's the sort of the Kia equivalent, I suppose, or whatever. Poland is also buying 1,000 Korean battle tanks. It's buying 672 Korean self-propelled guns. It means that ultimately, qualitatively and quantitatively, Poland will be the most powerful European member of NATO. And you compare that with our 148 Challenger 3 tanks. It makes you wonder. And we've got a lot to do. I mean, Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, pointing out that you're not going to get the regiments back and what have you. All of these enabling things, more artillery, more signals, more electronic warfare, more counter UAV. These are all the lessons initially that are being drawn from this conflict. Another very obvious corollary of industrial scale warfare is that there's no civilian sanctuary. Ukrainian cities are being hit. Terrible things have been done in occupied Ukrainian territory and so on. It's not. It's again back to the kind of warfare that we have not seen in Europe in our generation. It also means that you have economic warfare. Are we? I've often been asked on the radio. Are we at war with Russia? Is NATO at war with Russia? Gracious, I mean, if it was the other way around, we might believe that we were at war with Russia, but we're certainly at economic war with Russia, both in terms of the sanctions leveled on Russia from the West, and of course, Russia's efforts to disrupt energy supplies going the other way. And I suppose, in a complicated world, this is what has happened since the start of the war. Russia's income has not been significantly damaged, though, of course, sanctions take time to have an effect. The Russian economy has also been impacted by large numbers of highly skilled people leaving because they don't want to be conscripted. It's been messed up by the conscription process itself. So the economies of countries that are in one sense or another engaged in this conflict are very much fair game. And I mean, one general point about the war, we've talked a lot about things we can measure, although I've not been very good about giving statistics, but you can measure numbers of weapons, you can measure miles on maps and so on. Clearly what you can't measure is morale, commitment, sense of purpose and so on. And there Ukraine reminds us of an old lesson once again, that motivation and morale are absolutely crucial. There are very few Russian soldiers, I believe, who understand what they are fighting for in Ukraine. And if they think they know what they're fighting for, once they actually get involved in close combat, they seem to be not so sure. And we've actually listened to transmissions of Russians talking about what's going on and so on. What's going to happen next? Well, Ukraine clearly has the initiative. We're heading for the winter. You've got the sort of muddy season at the moment. It's getting colder. And it's recaptured some 54% of the occupied territory. The Russians are still pushing very, very hard in Donetsk and clearly have redeployed some forces from Kherson in the south there. They've stepped up, as we've seen in recent days, the infrastructure and terror attacks. They are also running out of weaponry to some extent. But of course, they've had to go to North Korea for ammunition. They've gone to Iran for drones. One possibility is they could be getting ballistic missiles from Iran. That would be very serious because they obviously have much larger warheads than many of the much smaller drones. The two sides, I think, have very contrasting winter goals. I mean, other than Donetsk, the Russians, I think, would like to consolidate, would like to calm things down over the winter, train up some of these many hopeless conscripts that they forced into the military. The Ukrainians would clearly like to carry on and retain and capitalize on their initiative. We just simply don't know how much ammunition and so on they have left. We don't know how many fully trained units, brigades they may have not yet committed to the battle. There's a lot of very loose talk about Zelensky. Sorry, I've really got it in for David Richards, haven't I? But I mean, he came out with an incredibly stupid statement yesterday. There's a lot of talk, the Ukrainians should be encouraged to make peace. Wars end by negotiation, not on the battlefield, so on and so forth. And he said words to the effect that we should no longer, we should stop subcontracting our security to Mr. Zelensky. Well, I mean, if the Ukrainians can destroy the Russian military capability, sounds like a very good idea to me. But of course, the reality is, of course, wars end with discussion. But the two sides need to be convinced that the time for discussion has come. And there's no likelihood of Russia at the moment stepping back. There is no likelihood of Mr. Zelensky accepting, certainly, that the territory occupied since February 24th or whatever it was is going to remain in Russian hands. Crimea is a problem in the longer term. There's no doubt about that. But, for now, nobody is talking too much about Crimea. So Zelensky has made out very clear his own sense of what the peace terms should be. Putin, of course, has really nailed his colours to the mast. And I think the twin decisions, the mobilization directive and the decision to annex parts of occupied Ukraine and indeed parts of unoccupied Ukraine has been a real Rubicon for him and changes he is now linked irrevocably with this campaign. And of course, as we've been touching on many times in this talk, there is the long haul industrial battle. Can Russia secure the microchips and the parts and so on that it needs to get output from its weapons factories? Can they overhaul and reconfigure older weaponry to re-equip forces in the field? Similarly, for the West, how far are our stocks of key weapon systems dwindling? I mean, remember, just as a closing thought, the Russian Air Force has not lost heavily in this war. It had some very intensive periods of activity and has to some extent sat out other phases of the war when it's still very much there. And if Ukraine were to run out of key surface-to-air weapons, particularly at mid-altitude, where the Russians did an awful lot of their work in Syria, the Russian Air Force could come into play again as a very potent force. So it ain't over. It's we're not even at half time, maybe, who knows, sadly, but the outcome isn't necessarily going to be a reflection of where we are now. I'm still optimistic, and I'm still fairly convinced that Ukraine will win through in the end, but it's going to depend upon a lot of external factors, and getting through the winter in countries like ours with no major energy disruptions and so on is also important. But training up Ukrainians, getting the vital weapons to them in a timely and effective manner is going to remain crucial to the ability of Ukraine to conduct its warfighting operations in the future.